Trump tariffs are taking the indexes across the world by storm. All major indexes across the world, like the Nasdaq, Dow Jones, Hang Seng, Nikkei, including BSE and Nifty back home, are in absolute free fall since the weekend. In fact, it's officially announced as a bear market in the US, with 3 consecutive days of markets going down so steeply, which hasn't happened since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Inflation will rise, growth will slow down, and recession fears are creeping in. Question is, why is Trump doing this? Knowing full well it'll affect the US markets and the consumers just as bad as markets across the world. He's certainly no slouch like Joe Biden either. He's sharp as a sniper even at this age. So what's going on? Is it just about setting off the trade imbalances of the US with other countries like China, Canada and Mexico and EU? Or is there something more secret? Today we'll be discussing that in more detail. This may sound like a conspiracy theory, but please bear in mind and stay until the end. In fact, if Trump's plan go through well, he could be saving the US government easily over $500 billion. That's billion with a B, or maybe even $1 trillion. How, you ask? Let's dig further. What's happening here isn't just about trade. It's about currency manipulation on a global scale. And Trump's playbook is straight out of an economic boardroom. This is going to be a long video because of the depth of complexity involved, so I urge you not to miss it. Let's jump back in. Question is, why is Trump doing this? Trump wants a weaker dollar, but still a dominant one. But here's the paradox. Trump is intentionally pushing for a weaker US dollar because weaker US dollar means US exports become cheaper across the world and become more competitive internationally, which means they can now get more international currencies across in the United States and make more money for US manufacturers. Foreign imports become more expensive, nudging Americans to buy local products, local goods. Sounds like a win, right? But there is a twist. It's hardly as simple. Trump doesn't want to lose dollar status as the global reserve currency. That's the golden goose. It gives America control over global finance, trade sanctions, and capital flows. So how do you ensure that you keep this delicate balance? How do you weaken the dollar without losing its throne as the reserve currency of the world? You essentially force foreign nations to do your dirty work. This isn't just about tariffs. It's about something far, far more, and which is far more systemic to the US economy. It's not even just about trade. This is about resetting the entire monetary order. We are probably at a point of another Bretton Woods-like major macroeconomic shift across the world. Be assured that the global trade ecosystem by the end of 2025 is not going to look the same. The key person behind this strategy is Stephen Moran, chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors. Before Stephen Moran joined the Trump administration as the economic advisor, he proposed something extremely radical, something that would send shockwaves through global markets. It was called the Malaga Accords. These are named after Trump's private club in Miami, Florida, and they are modeled on the Plaza Accords of 1985 and the Louvre Accords of 1987. Two historic agreements where major global powers came together to realign currencies and rebalance trade. Moran's idea was this. Number one, you use tariffs and currency manipulation with debt engineering to force global realignment in America's favor. Let's break this down, how exactly this would work. Number one, you weaponize tariffs and currency together. The idea wasn't just to punish China or Mexico with import taxes. It was to create a global financial tension, to make sure that foreign countries want to come to the table and renegotiate the trade agreements between the countries. The end goal? Push other countries to sell their US dollar reserves, weakening the dollar without the US having to intervene directly. But here's the twist. Instead of buying their own currencies back, which would create tremendous pressure on the US to have to pay the local other lenders, other governments with their own currencies, he floated the idea of having them buy crypto, which are essentially decentralized assets, as a kind of global liquidity sponge. This would weaken the dollar without empowering rival currencies. This is genius, absolutely, but extremely dangerous. Number two, he wanted to restructure US government debt quietly. US government, as you all know, is under tremendous debt of over $34 trillion, which is even more than the US GDP. This is where things get really spicy. The US is facing a $9 trillion bond maturity by 2026. Much of the debt was issued when the interest rates were near zero. Rolling it over at today's higher rates would explode the US national debt burden. So, what's the move? Miran proposed a forced exchange. Bondholders would have to swap short-term treasuries, which are for 2 to 10-year-old tenures, or maybe even 20, 30-year-old tenures, for 100 years or even perpetual bonds. These ultra-long bonds would carry low or even zero interest rates. Sound extreme? It is. But it would flatten the debt curve and buy America decades of breathing room. Number 3, escrow options or user fees for bondholders. If bondholders didn't want the 100-year swap, they'd have two choices. Either they'd have to place their bonds in escrow, essentially freeze them until the maturity duration is, which could be 10, 20 or 30 years, completely eliminating the secondary market for bonds, or they pay a user fee, which is a kind of a negative yield to keep holding them. This negative yield will be charged as a service fee, just like many banks in US and Switzerland charge a service fee for holding people's capital. So essentially it's a holding fee for holding the bonds. This effectively punishes passive debt holders, particularly foreign governments, while rewarding active capital deployment inside the US economy. It's like saying, you want to lend to us? Fine, but it's on our terms now. And now it is the lender who's negotiating terms. Rather than the lender negotiating terms with the borrower, it is now the borrower who's dictating terms with the lender. Number 4, capital controls on the table. If the restructuring spooked investors and it sparked a capital flight, Miran left the door open to capital controls, restricting how much money could leave or enter US markets. That's rare for a country like US. But in an era of de-dollarization, crypto, and inflation anxiety, it's not off the table anymore. So, what's the end game here? This isn't just monetary policy. It's monetary statecraft at its best. The Mar-a-Lago Accord isn't about making the economy fair. It isn't about making global trade fair. It is about making America cheaper to borrow from, harder to bet against, and ensure that they can borrow capital with practically zero interest over the next 10, 20, or maybe even 100 years. That is the real reason behind it, and make dollar more stronger compared to other countries, giving dollar an unfair advantage. Primarily making it independent of global buyers of US debt. In one move, it attempts to reindustrialize America, weaken the dollar strategically without increasing the negotiation power and the reserve currency status of other currencies across the world, control debt rollovers, and reposition US monetary dominance without another Bretton Woods. The fallout for other countries is going to be disastrous because, as I mentioned, these accords are specifically designed to favor America and America only, at the expense of other countries across the world. This is going to have a significant amount of collateral damage. Japan's yen is already getting crushed. Europe is facing imported inflation primarily because of US dollar bills. China is being boxed into local trade blocs, primarily in the Asian markets, because once the tariffs become live in the US, it will become extremely difficult and non-competitive for China to sell their manufacturing goods into the US. This forces the countries to tighten their own policies or develop non-dollar payment networks. Ironically, Trump's anti-globalist stance is accelerating the creation of multipolar trade ecosystems. While this may not be what Trump wanted, and he would try to block and resist it as much as he can, he might have to accept it as a trade-off for his bigger game plan. So far, we've seen inflation rising, markets wobbling, and foreign governments scratching their heads. But what if I told you this is exactly what Trump wanted? Because behind the noise, the tariffs are unlocking a set of hidden advantages that almost no one is talking about. Number 1, treasury yields are following, and it could save the US government hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe even trillions. Let's start with the big one, the US treasury yields. You've probably seen the headlines, but it's completely swept under the radar. The 10-year treasury has dropped below 4%. The 2-year treasury has dropped down to 3.63%. This is not just a market move, it's a massive win for the US Treasury. Here's why. The US government has 9 trillion in treasury bonds which are coming due by the end of 2026. Most of these were issued during near zero interest rate era. If the government had to refinance them at 4 to 5% interest rates, that would be a complete budget disaster. Imagine having to pay trillions of dollars of interest for an economy which is already at $34 trillion debt. But now, with yields dropping, thanks to fears of recession, deflation, and global instability, the US can refinance at a cheaper rate, saving up to $540 billion in interest payments with just a 0.5% reduction in interest rates. And if the interest rates reduce further, that could mean even more savings. As I mentioned earlier, Trump is trying to negotiate and get the bond yields down to as low as possible to minimize the interest repayment of the debt. Number 2, cheaper capital, which would lead to industrial rebuilding. With lower yields, the US can also issue new bonds at lower interest rates, raising more capital for domestic investment. Think about, say, building factories, subsidizing semiconductor plants, expanding infrastructure, building more EVs, building solar power infrastructure, and a lot of other forms of domestic manufacturing boost which can be given, and bringing back the golden days of America, where America used to be the global manufacturing powerhouse. Tariffs make foreign goods expensive, but cheap capital makes it easier to produce those same goods back home. This is Trump's dream scenario. Penalize imports, lower borrowing costs, but bring back industrial America, and that would help drive a lot of industrial manufacturing, bring a lot of jobs to the middle America, which has over the last 3 decades have become turned into complete ghost towns, and people have shifted their operations from those areas and moved on to other larger cities where services are more focused rather than manufacturing. So this is what Trump really is looking forward to. It's not protectionism, it's a full-scale reindustrialization campaign. Number 3, debt restructuring without default. As mentioned earlier, Trump's economic advisor Stephen Moran has floated a quiet restructuring of US debt. The plan is offer long-term holders the option to swap the maturing treasuries for 100 years or even perpetual zero interest bonds, or require bondholders to escrow their debt or pay a user fee. It's controversial, yes. Some say it's financial engineering, yes. Others, they say it's genius, because if successful, it would let the US extend the maturity of its debt without spooking markets or triggering a default. But is it truly a really safe idea? Because if we look at it in simple English, Trump would essentially delay payments, his interest payments, which are due for the US government. So now you might want to think that this is a good idea for the US government. It would reduce interest, it would free up trillions in fiscal room, all without technically breaking any of their debt obligations. But let's look at it one more time, because this is not a conventional business scenario. Normally when you take a loan, you're supposed to pay back. But here, it is the borrower who's trying to dictate terms to the lender, and that's where the entire problem is. Let's be honest, tariffs are not the end goal. Trump isn't trying to win in round 1. He's using tariffs as a negotiation leverage. The real goal is to extract better trade deals with other government, force foreign currencies to open their markets, pressure allies to spend more on defense and NATO so that the US government doesn't end up spending more and doesn't increase their debt even further, and essentially reshape global supply chains in America's favor. Think of it like poker. He's raising the stakes, forcing everyone to either fold or show their cards. The truth is, Trump is willing to accept short-term economic pain. He knows tariffs hurt customers. He knows Wall Street might panic. But with the rising US debt of $34 trillion already, which is significantly more than their GDP, he has very limited options. And this seems like one of the only options which is left with to ensure that he can still manage the debt which the US government is facing currently. Here's the thing, he essentially wants a reset. He wants to reduce US dependence on China. He wants to sever risky global ties and prepare the country for a new industrial era. Tariffs, currency pressure, yield manipulation. It's all a part of a controlled demolition of the old model, the one that hollowed out American factories and created massive debt. And in its place, he wants to build something new, something resilient, where the US government is now focusing more on manufacturing, bringing back not just a lot of manufacturing jobs, but also saving their money, where instead of their money going to international countries behind imports, they can keep that money in house. So let's zoom out for a second. What do tariffs really mean? Tariffs are essentially economic leverage. It doesn't expect to make money from tariffs. The idea is to increase the tariffs so that the domestic reindustrialization takes place. Number two, falling yields, lower debt payments and cheaper capital. This would mean that the US debt of $34 trillion, the interest payments can be reduced and delayed as much as possible, and they get access to cheaper capital which can be used for reindustrializing America. Number three, crypto redirection. With dollar weakening without boosting rivals, this is a masterstroke. Also, once crypto prices appreciate, you use them to repay more of the debt. Number four, debt restructuring. This gives them more fiscal room in terms of investing more in infrastructure and assets. Number five, supply chain reset, which would lead to strategic independence. Most leaders respond to crisis. Trump, he's engineering one to reshape the system itself. Okay, quick pause. I've spoken about treasury yields dropping like it's a good thing, but what does that actually mean? What are treasury yields really? Let me break it down. A treasury yield is basically the interest rate the US government pays when it borrows money. If the US wants to borrow $1 trillion, it does that by issuing bonds, treasuries, notes, basically IOUs, and promises to pay investors back with a little interest over time. Now here's the key. The yield goes up when investors think the economy is growing. Inflation is rising. The Fed is raising rates. The yield goes down when there are inflationary tendencies in the market, when investors are extremely scared, where the market either enters a bear market or it leads to recessionary environment. They expect lower growth than what is expected in the market right now. The treasury investors are essentially investors who want safe haven assets. They don't want to invest in risky assets like equities or other kind of variable yield products where they might make more, but at the same time they might lose more. They want safe haven assets, especially in times of such troubling markets. So why do yields drop when things get risky? Imagine this. You're an investor. The stock market is volatile. The equity markets are volatile. China's economy is slowing. Europe's in a mess. You have billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars of money. Where do you park your cash? During such time, you do not want to park your cash in high risk assets like equity markets or other more high risk avenues for investment. You want to put it in safe assets where at least the principal capital is saved. That's what they look for during such times. So when you have hundreds of billions of dollars of money, what do you invest in? You invest in safe, boring, guaranteed US Treasury bonds, because US Treasury essentially cannot default, or at least that's what the investors think. So the US demand for US Treasuries goes up, and when the demand goes up, the yield goes down. Bond prices and yields move in opposite directions. More demand means higher price, which means lower yield. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Trump's tariffs, they stir up uncertainty. They create risk. They slow down global trade. That might seem bad for a lot of businesses, a lot of investors across the world. But guess what investors do when the world feels risky? They rush towards US Treasuries, because US Treasuries are essentially the safest, or are considered to be the safest investment avenues in the world right now. And when they do that, Treasury yields fall. And that's a huge win for the US government. Lower yields means cheaper borrowing costs. Think of it this way. If the US has to roll over $9 trillion in debt by 2026, and you can reduce the interest rate by even 0.5%, that's a $540 billion savings. Nearly the cost of the entire US military for a year. Imagine the amount of savings that they could make and amount of new infrastructure and new investments which they could make from the money that is saved. And instead of 0.5%, they can get 1.5, 2% savings. It could go up to $2 trillion of saving for the US government. The treasury yields are essentially a thermometer of investor sentiment and economic expectations. When Trump ramps up tariffs, it increases global uncertainty. That pushes investors into US bonds, lowering yields. And that gives the US cheaper capital and massive relief on their debt. That's not just an economic side effect. That's the part of the playbook which they are playing. So you might be thinking, wait, maybe this isn't chaos. Maybe it's controlled. It turns out what looks like economic mayhem into a cold, calculated geopolitical chess game. And that might be true, especially for the US, because this is essentially all done to save the US government's interest payments on the treasury bonds. So even though they might have to bear the pain for the short term, in the long run, this could turn out to be beneficial for the US government. But let's look at the part which most people never see coming. What if Trump's trade war, the tariffs, the inflation, the currency turbulence, they aren't bugs in the system. They are features of a much bigger plan. This is the strategic playbook, and that is absolutely ruthless. Trump's tariffs aren't just about getting better trade deals. They are about reshaping the balance of global power, using economic pain as a weapon. Let's walk through how it exactly is work and how exactly Trump is planning to pressurize countries across the world to create more beneficial environment for the US. Number one, they want to apply pressure to adversaries like China. China runs a massive trade surplus with the US. It sends cheap goods to America and in return receives dollars, which it often uses to buy US treasuries. Tariffs disrupt this loop. They hurt China's export machine. How many of us have seen videos of China manufacturing? They are burning the products which they've created because there's not enough demand, and they want to ensure that there is some sort of scarcity so that the prices of the goods that they manufacture don't go down. And this creates a huge crisis in China as well. They push Beijing towards selling US debt, which ironically weakens the dollar, something which Trump wants. And even if they don't sell, they get lesser interest rates on those bonds. This is a win-win scenario for Trump. He hurts China economically, he nudges the dollar down, and still investors flood into treasuries as a safe haven. Imagine that. You deliberately create conditions of crisis for the global economy, and yet investors are flocking, investing more towards you so that they can save their capital. If that's not genius, I don't know what is. Point number two, leverage pain for better negotiations. Tariffs aren't meant to last forever. They are bargaining chips. Trump slaps a 60% tariff on Chinese goods. He's promising a 20% tariff on Indian goods. But he's already waiting with a deal in his back pocket. What he's looking for essentially is to drop your tech transfer policies. Open your markets to our banks and cloud companies. China has been notoriously protective of their local markets and hasn't allowed US tech giants and financial giants to make an entry into the Chinese banking system. He wants to open those markets for the US companies. Cut the espionage and IP theft. It's high pressure economics. Just like he did it with Iran, just like he did with NATO and NAFTA, and currently is doing with the Ukraine-Russia war. Number three, reverse engineer US industrial power. Here's the real long game. Trump knows America deindustrialized too fast. Cheap labor overseas gutted the Rust Belt. Now he wants to rebuild the core, but slowly and selectively. Tariffs make foreign goods expensive. Lower yields make capital cheap. Government incentives bring factories home. It's not isolationism, it is selective reindustrialization. Think about industries like chips, EVs, biotech, defense tech, the strategic sectors of the 21st century. Disrupt without destroying. Finally, here's what makes this playbook so dangerous and so effective. Trump creates just enough distraction, just enough disruption to cause pain, but not enough to break the system. He destabilizes global trade, he destabilizes what the existing trade negotiations are, what the existing tariff system is, but not to the point of collapse. He weakens the dollar, forces other countries to start investing more towards crypto, without eliminating the global dominance of dollar. He spooks markets, but then provides just enough policy certainty to calm them. This is a very complex geopolitical juggling act. Love him or hate him, he's damn good at it. Question is, how successful would he be in implementing such a delicate dance over here? So what exactly are we really watching here? You're not seeing a trade war, you're not seeing a delusional old crazy man randomly imposing tariffs across the world. There is a lot of strategy, a lot of specific direction which is going on in each and every move which is happening over here. You're seeing a systematic reset. Trump is trying to reverse 30 years of globalism, and he's doing it using tariffs, treasury yield manipulation, currency warfare, strategic debt restructuring, and the global game of economic chicken. This isn't economics. This is global master play, and he's bringing the principles of business negotiations and taking it to a scale which has never been seen before. This is statecraft through financial engineering. This might be the most underrated piece of Trump's entire tariff strategy and the global economic strategy right now. It's not just about China. It's not even just about trade. It's about reversing a 30-year decline in American industrial power by lowering the treasury yields, reindustrializing America because of access to cheaper capital, which would then re-stimulate the entire manufacturing ecosystem. Since the 1990s, US has shed over 6 million manufacturing jobs. Factories have closed, small towns have hollowed out, entire supply chains are offshored to China, Mexico, Canada, Southeast Asia, and other countries across the world. And while America went all in on tech and finance, countries like China, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, they doubled down on their industrial strength, dominating global manufacturing in everything from steel to semiconductors. Trump doesn't just see that as an economic failure, he sees it as a national security threat. He sees the fact that the US government has lost access to so much core manufacturing, even defense for that matter, that most of the defense of US, most of the ships which are being used in the US are now being made in China. He sees this as a significant national security threat. So the new battlefield is not an actual war, but the trade war which Trump has instigated. And they are focusing on strategic sectors. This time, the tariffs aren't on cheap goods like t-shirts or toys. They are focused like a laser on future critical industries: electric vehicles, semiconductors and microchips, solar panels and renewable energy tech, battery manufacturing, high technology steel and aluminum. The goal? Force these industries to build inside the US, not because of subsidies or incentives, but because it becomes too expensive to operate from abroad. The entire focus is simple: get the treasury yields low, which means the US government won't default on the debt payments, and not just that, ensure that the future debt payments are lower as well. This would lead to reduced interest rates for getting loans from the banks. This would mean reindustrializing America because now they have access to easy capital to prop up their manufacturing again. This is not a short-term project but a long-term project, and that's what Trump is focusing on. Trump's unorthodox tariff logic is simple. He is breaking the rules of trade economics. Most trade policies across the world, they set tariffs based on World Trade Organization rules or the fair market pricing or reciprocity. You tax us, we tax you. Trump is not interested in that. Instead, he is using a blunt metric right now: the trade deficit. So, if the US buys $3 billion of imports more from China than it sells, that's a $300 billion imbalance which Trump wants to connect. And boom, a 60% tariff. If the US is running a $100 billion deficit in Mexico, that's a 10, 20, 30% import tax coming along the way of Mexico. There's no nuance, there's no economics over there, just plain simple: these are the trade balances, I'm going to correct them with whatever tariff that I want. That is the simple approach which is using. It is simple negotiation by brute force. You sell to us more than we sell to you, we tax you until it hurts. That's what Trump is saying right now, and that's the entire focus of his tariff policy. It's part pressure tactic, part score settling, and part strategy to force industrial reshoring. What makes this radical? Because no major global leader in the modern times has ignored standard tariff calculations. They have not ignored, they have tied trade penalties directly to bilateral trade deficit ratios. They have targeted tariffs as a tool for reindustrialization, not just for trade fairness. They are combining tariffs with interest rate engineering and currency pressure. Trump isn't trying to rebalance global trade. While you might think that he's just trying to build up and ensure that the trade balances are set off, it's quietly more complicated than that. He's trying to rewrite the rule book entirely and bring factories back into the US as a byproduct of financial aggression. So here's the $1 trillion question. What is the world doing in response? If Trump is swinging the hammer of tariffs across the world and pressuring the dollar to weaken itself so that the exports become more competitive, how are other countries reacting to this and how are they protecting themselves? The answer is they are not sitting still because of the nature of the Trump tariffs which are there and the tonality and aggression by which is pushing it. Obviously, the countries across the world are taking it far more seriously. They are building a new world order of trade, one that doesn't revolve around the United States. Asia is increasingly starting to trade within itself. Asia, led by China, is already years into this strategy. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, also known as RCEP, brings together China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and 10 other Asian nations for the same. India had backed out of this trade bloc a couple of years back, citing personal reasons, domestic reasons, where they felt that the trade group was not going to benefit them. But it's right now the largest trade bloc in the world, and the US isn't even a part of it. Asian countries are increasing trade with each other, reducing their exposure to US tariffs, the dollar, and even US tech. They are starting to transact within local currencies to eliminate the dependence on the dollar for global trade. China's Belt and Road Initiative is also creating new trade corridors to Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. This will completely eliminate the dependence on US dollar and the international trade movement systems, which are highly controlled by the US dollar. Europe is also turning inward in the face of growing US unpredictability, not just under Trump, but since 2016. Europe is starting to focus on increasing intra-European trade. They are doubling down on energy independence. They are strengthening financial frameworks like the EU Recovery Fund, and even floated ideas of a digital euro to reduce dollar dependence. The more the US weaponizes trade and finance, the more Europe wants a plan B. BRICS. This is the trade bloc which is making the most noise ever since COVID-19. BRICS wants to expand the anti-dollar bloc. This is essentially the economic alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's no longer just symbolic. In 2024, they expanded to include Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran. Rest of the Asian countries as well, primarily in the West Asia markets. They are working on a shared currency framework for trade settlement, and they are actively encouraging bilateral trade in local currencies. In other words, we'll sell oil for yuan, we'll trade minerals in rupees, we don't need dollars anymore. This is a systematic challenge to US monetary hegemony, and it's gaining momentum. So what's really going on here? We've seen the surface level pay, tariffs, trade wars, dollar depreciation, lower treasury yields, inflation pressures. But beneath all of that, this isn't chaos, it's strategy. It's economic war disguised as domestic policy. Trump isn't just trying to fix a trade imbalance or tweak a few import taxes. He's trying to reshape the entire global world order in America's favor. By forcing industrial rebirth at home, by weaponizing treasury yields to ease the debt burden, by shaking global confidence in the dollar just enough to make exports boom, but not collapse the system, and by creating so much geopolitical discomfort that countries come crawling back to the table with fewer cards in their hands. This is not diplomacy. This is high stakes, high leverage, winner take all strategy. And whether you agree with him or not, it's working in ways most people don't see it coming. And even though this might lead to weakening of the US dollar in the globe in the long run, it would still mean significant savings for the US government in terms of the treasury yields and in terms of the debt that they owe. So even though they might lose on one end, the victories more than offsets what the losses are going to be. So it's working in ways where we can't even comprehend what's really going to happen. So if you made it this far, you're obviously not here for surface level takes. You want to understand the real game behind the headlines. So here's what you can do. Drop a comment below, Do you think Trump's tariff strategy is genius or dangerous? What trade blocks or economic shifts do you see forming near you? And make sure to hit that subscribe button. Remember, this is just an opinion. Some people might call it a conspiracy theory, but there is a very strong policy behind it. There is a very strong thought process behind it, and especially with Trump's chief economic advisor literally writing a paper before Trump's inauguration on exactly the same, it might not be too far-fetched from the truth. Trump's tariffs are taking the index, so that's why it makes it extremely plausible that this theory is going to be true.